Complexity and complexity theory have been around for 30 or more years. But applied complexity, that is, computer simulation models that illustrate complex systems at work, applied complexity is somewhat younger. Originally, these simulation models were visually crude, just a matrix of colored squares in a matrix of relatively small dimensions. But in time, as digital hardware and software improved, the simulation tools became richer. The visuals and their underlying analytic statistics looked like more familiar images. At a fundamental level, all of these reflect a dynamic system perspective. That is, a group of interacting, interrelated, or interdependent elements forming a complex and dynamic whole. This wildfire simulation, built with an open source program called NetLogo, integrates topographic layers, roads, and traffic flow, depending on the time of day, temperatures, wind speed, and fire fuel variables. Since the early 2000s, scientists in Cuba, especially those with a transdisciplinary perspective, have become interested in complexity. While some Cuban physicists were working in nonlinear dynamics, it was a lecture by Alicia Guerrero to the Instituto de Filosofía in November 2000 that seemed to light a spark. 6 or 8 years later, there were 10 cathedra or study groups scattered around Cuba focusing on complexity, and the Havana group began subject. In 2008, Tom Johnson of Santa Fe's Institute for Analytic Journalism demonstrated applied complexity at Cuba's annual conference on complexity held in Camagüey, Cuba. Applied complexity builds on the theory of complexity and, using computing tools, tests, visualizes, and demonstrates concepts like complex adaptive systems, emergence, and self-organization. Perhaps more importantly, these simulations are increasingly based on real data. Real vehicles moving in streets or real boats moving through the canals of Venice. Those demonstrations triggered an invitation to conduct a one-day training session on simulation models for Cuban scholars a year later. And the response to that training session resulted in an invitation from the Cuban National School for Public Health to conduct a week-long simulation modeling session in January 2012. With funding from the LeBaron Foundation and the Christopher Reynolds Foundation, and coordination by Alicia Guerrero of Friends of Havana's January Complexity Seminars, a 3-man team from Santa Fe, New Mexico and Bogota, Colombia, traveled to Havana in January 2012. Here, Stephen Guerin and Nick Bennett, 2 of the team members, reflect on their Cuban experience.
The students were primarily high-level academics as well as administrators and researchers in the School of Public Health. So they were looking for new techniques for analyzing problems with a lot of interactions, which agent-based modeling is a nice tool to tease out when you're looking at things like how do disease spread when you have a mobile population and infrequent and frequent interactions and a kind of a jumble. So they're very interested in that kind of thing, but it also looked into agricultural issues like how disease spreads amongst trees, so not just human, but plants too.
Some of them had done their homework in advance, had read some of the literature that they had access to. As Steve mentioned, there's a lot of things they theoretically have access to. They take a long time to download, slow connections, so sometimes they're very difficult for them to practically get them. So some of them had done that, had read some papers, had experimented a little bit, even a few of them with NetLogo and the NetLogo model library. For the most part, they simply showed up with open minds, ready to engage, which one of the things that was very different about this, a lot of times when we deal with professionals in their field who are thrown into a technical environment that they're not familiar with, a piece of software that's new to them, a concept, a modeling approach that's new to them, there's a certain kind of pessimism bordering on cynicism right at the start of I can't do this, or I don't have the time to do this. Saw almost none of that. So that was the best preparation possible.
I would say maybe in three components. The first was just giving a little bit of background of what is applied complexity. How has this been used in the real world as opposed to just academic papers? And showing them some example past projects. And giving a little bit of theory of complexity as a primer in a couple hours, just to, what are we talking about? What's the difference between complexity and maybe dynamical systems or things they may have heard about in the past? The second process then was the nuts and bolts of how to implement a NetLogo programming. Things like what is a turtle or agent, what is a patch, and what is an edge. Just the general three things that they kind of need to know. And then the last bit was taking the mechanics and applying it to one of their problems. So that was more their applied opportunity.
I was actually surprised by the amount of NetLogo that had been translated. The documentation, it lags behind the software. It was not a very English capable group. So we, as is our usual practice in these sorts of environments, we bounced around a lot. I spoke Spanish probably about half the time. Por favor, su atención, leva.
We had the benefit before going down there that 2 years ago there was a translation exercise by Alfredo Quevedo, organized by Tom Johnson, to translate the English documentation into Spanish. So that was a nice side-by-side resources for people that maybe have a problem with the English, what's going on with this function. They could kind of look up at the Spanish equivalent, and that really eased the process. When we were working on just giving them a background in applied complexity, we showed them examples of a stadium evacuation, where we take in the geometry from a CAD file of a stadium and showing them how you could simulate the evacuation, and giving them metaphors of previous models that we showed them of like how ants find food and how birds flock, and they could see how those mechanics are played out in a model of an evacuation. We also showed them forest fire models, as well as past work in traffic routing. We showed them things, very canonical models in agent-based modeling. One of them is an ant food foraging model, which if you think about how ants have to find food, but there's nobody in charge of the system. So how can we break that down, as nature does, into a simpler problem at the lower level, but where you have a very emergent, complex, adaptive, and intelligent behavior at the level of the colony? So in that case, ants walk out from a nest and drop a little chemical scent back to the nest. And if they happen to find food, they change their behavior and start dropping a food pheromone while following the nest pheromone home. And so that's they start to see, oh, you can program from the micro level, but not really know where the food is, and let that kind of solution evolve and emerge. So in the next model we would show is flocking, how you can simulate a flock of birds with very simple rules. And get a flock of behavior that can go around obstacles. Combining those two mechanics, we were able to show, well, it's not unlike how people are evacuating from a stadium. Some are following a pheromone field to their car or a preferred exit, but at the same time trying to keep a minimum distance from their neighbor, while at the same time kind of keeping with the crowd. So they could kind of see how the ant model and the flocking model came together into an applied model.
So we encourage them to work individually on ideas, or in pairs or trios on ideas of projects that were important to them, that they wanted to work on, and basically have them sell them to the group. So they gave presentations on their project ideas, and as a group, they selected 2 projects to work on.
And in this process, I think it was kind of interesting too, because that process of saying, is this a good project to use this type of modeling approach? Because that type of modeling, agent-based modeling, isn't a cure-all for all problems. So it's like, let's try to find as a group certain problems that really come into this domain well. And so they wrote maybe 9 examples up on the board, and the teams pitched it, and the 2 were selected that we actually ultimately worked on.
The first project was an agricultural project. A particular kind of infestation with a fruit fly as a vector. Particularly troubling because once the damage to the fruit or the tree is visible, that tree is gone, that tree is lost. And so responding, coming up with intervention actions for this infestation is a huge priority for them. So there were a couple of people in the room who were from that background, who had that expertise, and they were the ones who came up with that idea and sold it to the rest of the attendees. And it was, I don't know that we showed them some examples of, okay, here's kind of some nuts and bolts of models that may be a good starting place. But that one was particularly impressive because Steve and I had to leave for the better part of a day to go and make a presentation at the campus of the School of Public Health. And they were mostly working on their own, with our assistants remained behind to work with them. But they really were expected to do a lot of independent work that day, and we came back and they had done a really, really nice job on that model.
And so this agricultural model of this infectious disease amongst trees required a little bit of a GIS or geographic information systems, where you're able to bring in some attributes of the land. Prior to that, we showed them what some possibilities were in bringing in layers of pictures that would represent perhaps density of trees, or it could be the elevation, and showed them how they could also bring in shape files in GIS. And so that was how we'd kind of lead with a little bit of tools, and then how do you want to apply it. That transitioned to the second model on the second day when we were there for the full day, looking at the transmission of AIDS amongst a population, and looking at things like what is the frequency of interactions, and what are the densities, and what are the incidence curves. And this was a type of model that could traditionally be done with a mathematical equations, and how in a dynamical systems approach, where you look at some variables and how they play off of each other. And I think they had the experience now of looking at over space, which was very hard to do with just pure equations, and introducing agents allowed the problem to be a lot more spatial.
They had real data in the case of the infestation. They used it primarily as validation data. Does this model that we've built look like what happens in the real world? And so tuning the parameters of the model to match their validation data. The AIDS model was kind of different modeling motivations, if you will. There is, in the models library of NetLogo, an HIV transmission model. They, as a lot of people do, looked at that model and said, well, that's interesting, but it's very simplistic. It's too simplistic. And there's always this tension in doing this kind of modeling of, how many factors do we include in the model? We have something very simple that clearly doesn't, or in this case, doesn't really suit our needs. But do we want to spend the next 10 years building models that are more and more detailed? And I think that some of them did get close to the understanding there that we really try to leave them with, which is that you model as much as necessary and no further. You model and start exercising a model, simulating, and if it starts to show you something interesting, then that's a good place to be before you start bringing in 50 other factors. So they identified a few not so much from data, but from their own experience, they identified a few risk behaviors that were in the model, but they said we need finer distinctions on these risk behaviors rather than look at the probability that some undistinguished random individual in the population engages in these risk behaviors. Let's divide the population into a small number of primary groups and at least distinguish between those groups for looking at the probability of engaging in these risk behaviors. And that was I think a good compromise, a good mix, and it was a good use of their own understanding and expertise in the problem, bringing it into the model.
One of the things that I think that worked out really well was after the second phase, when we showed them the mechanics, we assigned to the students go look in the code examples, which are really nice nuggets in the NetLogo model library of how to do certain kinds of things, kind of the motifs that you use often, and usually they're little clever pieces of script. And we assigned about 12 of these out to the students so that each student would understand one of these motifs very well and present it back to the class. And so I think that gave the opportunity to present it back in a kind of a very colloquial Spanish, but also to have each one of them understanding a deeper, elegant way of coding in there. The students also then presented a second time at the conclusion of the class when they were presenting the results of the two models that they worked on. Both of those they presented after that day, so it gave them a nice time of presenting their work back to their colleagues. I received some very nice emails from some of the younger IT-centric developers that were there that were also a little bit entrepreneurial, looking at starting up a computer engineering company. And I received some questions of advice on how to implement certain kinds of models in the IT domain of managing networks and routers, but modeling them from this applied complexity perspective. That was kind of a nice result.
Complex systems exist in infinite degrees of scaling, from the atomic and genomic level to the whole of the universe. The excitement and the challenge today is in exploring where to enter that continuum of complexity and what tools can we use to better understand how systems work. And then apply that understanding to making life on this planet better for all living things here. There is also excitement in putting that understanding to work. That's applied complexity.